Okay, right. As far as this afternoon is concerned, I'm delighted to welcome Richard Cohen, the great nephew, I think he told me, of Jack Cohen. All of us will know Tesco from our young days to our current days, and how that business has changed over the years. I remember it myself well in the small grocery shops, how they led the charge into self-service grocery and in today's hypermarkets. And I happened just to be reading in today's paper, and it reminded me because another great grocery chain, Morrison's, has had a bid come in for it. But it said that Tesco's, and probably still is, every pound, 1 in every 8 pounds spent in the high street was through Tesco stores. And Jack Cohen's original line was, "Pile it high, sell it cheap." So, Richard, I'm sure you're going to fill us in.
You're giving away all my trade secrets here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll stop there, Richard.
I'm very impressed with your research. But I'm going to put it, if you can allow me to share my screen now. Well, a very good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to visit Bushy again, albeit not in person, because I was last with you a couple of years ago and I spoke about Winston Churchill. I'm actually the founder of a Facebook site called Winston Churchill, and we've now got 20,000 participants in 7 months. So you won't be surprised if at some stage there's going to be a reference to Winston Churchill here today. Now, I've just moved house recently, and it's amazing what one can find in a loft when one moves house. So here is a picture, a photograph of Jack, and to his right, Lady Sissy Cohen, Lady Sarah Cohen. This is at about the time when Jack received his knighthood, about 1969. I don't know who the other 2 ladies are, and I don't know why His late Royal Highness has his arm in a sling. He's still looking very debonair, and I'm sure it was an occasion which gave much pride to Jack and Sissy, especially when one has regard to his background. That was no doubt a more formal photograph on a similar occasion. Now, many people who like to mess around with the internet will tell you that the name Tesco is derived from the last 2 initials of the name Cohen and Jack's wife Tessa. Quite how they managed to work out that her name was Tessa, I really don't know, because her name was Sissy, or more formally Sarah. But it's one of those urban myths that it's almost impossible to shake. But we will talk about the how Tesco's name came about in some slides a little bit later on. Yeah, this was another slide that I found, and it relates to the fact that Jack was keen on the GGs, and he did purchase a horse called Tesco Boy, which you can see one here at the Rose of York State. So there was quite a lot more to Jack than just being the chairman and president of a supermarket. A couple of years back, I gave a talk. Sorry, I just trying to get rid of something at the top there, but never mind. I gave a talk at Limwood, and this was the first slide. And when people came into the room, they thought that they'd come into the wrong room because they'd imagined that they were going to see a talk about Tesco, but there was a photograph of Napoleon on there, so they started walking out. Anyway, I managed to get them to come back again because there's a reason why I've put Napoleon on the screen here, and that is that he made a statement about the English, which I'm sure you all remember from your history lessons at school, because he said that the English were a nation of shopkeepers, and whether he meant that as a compliment or not, I don't know. Probably not, but the English themselves don't mind the label shopkeepers, because it's a very honourable trade, really, because it requires a lot of discipline and hard work and the work ethic, and it also requires service as well. And those are very important values in society. We had our own foreign secretary and prime minister who had a riposte to Napoleon, George Canning. He actually presided as prime minister for a shorter period even than Theresa May, because he actually died in office. And he responded to Napoleon by saying, "Be yours the glory of war and conquest, followed by ruin and retrenchment, and be ours the glory of trade and peace." If we were to go back 100 years, you would want to know what society was like for the average working man. And there were plenty of people who wrote about it, not least Marx and Engels. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that these commentators said about what life was like at the turn of the 20th century. And you'll see there's an example of boys rather ill-clothed, but the most important thing is that they don't look as though they've had many baths, and they're not shod, they're not wearing shoes or socks. So that was not an uncommon sight in the Victorian and Edwardian times. This was the staple of the sort of food that people would consume at the time, dripping and bread. This was when, as Disraeli said, the world was for the few and for the very few. Bed bugs, I don't suppose anybody remembers that, but our grandparents may well have done, well remember that. It's very easy for rich people to preach the virtues of self-reliance to the poor. It is also very foolish because, as a matter of fact, the wealthy, so far from being self-reliant, are dependent on the constant attention of scores and sometimes hundreds of persons who are employed in waiting upon them and ministering to their wants. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Some of this filtered through to Jack and his immediate successor, Ian Maclaurin, because Jack imparted some wisdom to him on his first day at Tesco. Remember one thing, that the most humble person in the organization is the most important. By the way, none of the previous slides that I've shown you were the words of Friedrich Engels or Karl Marx. They were all came out of the pen or the mouth of none other than Winston Churchill. Some of you may have recognized, especially the one where he said that fancy having nothing interesting to talk about. That's a very Churchillian turn of phrase. So just as an example of a devoted employee of Tesco was this chap called Jim Harrow, who worked with Jack at Hackney, Hammersmith and Hoxton. Jack spotted him as a 14-year-old in one of the Croydon markets, and noting his skill and his ability to get the best pitch, so he soon had him running his stall and selling unlabelled tins of fruit and veg. Later, Tim became transport manager and met Jack's other employee, Peggy, whom he married in due course. Jim's loyalty to the governor was such that he only bought from Tesco for the rest of his life, and his sons worked for Tesco. In fact, he named one of his daughters after Shirley Porter. It's nice to be able to say something praiseworthy about Shirley Porter, because that she has come in for some pretty poor publicity over the years. Obviously, time won't permit me to read everything that's on here, but if you can just get a flavour of what Jim Harrow was saying about Tesco, that's all that's needed. So Jack, in appearance, looked a little bit like a prize fighter with a broken nose. Although he saw service in World War I, it wasn't during any fighting that he incurred that facial disfigurement, but it was through falling over on a pavement. He never had it fixed properly. There was a photographer at the time in the 1930s who was very much in demand, called Boris Bennett, and a lot of our parents or grandparents would have had studio photographs taken by him. And you can see that Jack's looking pretty debonair there. Now this is Jack. On the left is Mossy Vanga. And on the right is my grandfather Morris, who was Jack's brother. Morris was about 8 years older than Jack, and he didn't actually follow him into Tesco. He remained in the father's trade, which was that of a tailor. Just going back to Boris Bennett. You knew you'd arrived if Boris had taken your photograph. Before the war, he was so sought after that couples would queue on the stairs of his Whitechapel Road studio, and crowds would stand outside watching the brides arrive. One commentator described him as the man who brought Hollywood to the East End. I do wear another hat, that of chairman of the Essex Jewish Historical Society. And not so long ago, we had a very interesting talk by Boris's son, Michael. That talk was recorded. And if you'd like to see it, if you'd like to visit the Jewish Historical Society website, you'll be able to see it again. That's probably more Jack Cohen that you remember. He obviously didn't have Hollywood-style teeth. There's an environment in which he was always very happy, actually in the shops, in front of one of his stands saying, "Pile it high, sell it cheap." And he knew the value of publicity, because I think two chaps here are both footballers. I don't know who they are. If anybody does, perhaps they can put it in the chat box or tell us at the end. Even when he's in one of his shops, you can see that he regards dressing for the part as being very important. So there's a few books about Jack. This one by Morris Carina is quite outdated now. It's the only actual biography of him, and it really is about time it was updated. It says 1971 on there. There's another book which is about the Tesco story generally, which is written by David Powell, who's a former employee of Tesco. All of these you can get on Amazon, and a very interesting read by Ian McLaurin. If you like cricket, there's most of the last third of the book is all about his chairmanship of the MCC. So three books there. And then just going back to Jack's favourite arena again. So this is family picture. In the middle, obviously, is Sir Jack Cohen, also known as Sir John Edward Cohen. On our right is his son-in-law, Leslie Porter. And in the front row, just in front of him, is Shirley Porter. There's Sissy Cohen in the middle at the front. To the left of Jack, as we look at it, is Hyman Kreitman, and just in front of him in the front row is his wife. And we'll speak about them a little bit later. Irene Kreitman is his wife. One of the things about Jack Cohen was that he knew that if you're going to work in a market, you have to be a bit of an attention seeker. And this attribute never left him for the rest of his working life. So he was always employing actors and various other types of celebrities to help promote his image. Tesco is now an international company, not that far behind Walmart in terms of being one of the biggest supermarkets in the world. They expanded into Asia, and there's a rather smart museum in Korea, which if ever you're visiting, maybe on a cruise or something, you might just want to pop in. It looks pretty well turned out. There's a much smaller exhibition about Tesco at their head office in Welwyn Garden City. So we heard before that our chairman, the chairman of this meeting, said that one of the things that Tesco was known for was its slogan of piling it high and selling it cheap. This was just one way of giving evidence to Jack's philosophy that the whole idea of a supermarket is to give value for money to its customers. So when he would meet other traders or even royalty, I believe he gave one of these to Prince Philip when he was made a Sir, and it's got a motto on there which reads, well, when he's presenting it to royalty, it reads, you can't do business sitting on your armchair. But when he was presenting it to someone who was less high up in the world, it would read, you can't do business sitting on your arse. So this is 1968 at the Grosvenor Rooms, which is no more. And that was me at my bar mitzvah. It was rather embarrassing, actually, at my bar mitzvah, because Sir John had forgotten to send a present, not that I particularly deserved one, but my father had to phone him up and tell him, and he ended up sending me £150 in premium bonds, which I think was a pretty good present in 1968 values. Not that I've ever won anything since then. So Jack was born in Whitechapel, one of a family of many who came from Russia in the 1880s, many of which the father was a tailor, and Jack's father was extremely religious, and he expected his children to go into the same trade as him. As I said before, my grandfather Morris was quite happy to do that, but Jack was a bit of a rebel. To the school he attended, I don't think he got his broken nose as a result of a fight he got into arising out of anti-Semitism. And they moved on to Darnley Road in Hackney, and then Gore Road in Clapton, which I think is near to Victoria Park, or maybe it's Gunton Road that's Clapton. All these areas are becoming quite gentrified now. But then there's quite a considerable leap up from here to, I think it's at Chessington Avenue, actually, in Finchley, not Chessington Road. This is just an example of one of the houses in that area. One thing that is worthy of note was that in World War II, Lady Clementine Churchill visited Jack's house to raise money for medical aid to Russia, which is quite appropriate when we're talking about this today being the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. Jack was also one of the founding members of the Kinloss Shawl, and in fact, if you go to the Shawl, you'll see a plaque outside that mentions that fact, that I think he laid the foundation stone. Then Jack's final residence was an apartment in Cumberland Terrace. I'm not suggesting that everything that you see in that photograph was his flat, but he certainly had a very commodious accommodation there, which is a considerable achievement for somebody who started life as a barrow boy, or as Ian McLaurin would call it, a costermonger. So Jack, in 1917, decided he wanted to volunteer for the Royal Flying Corps, where his tailoring skills in sewing up air balloons and aircraft, parts of aircraft, came into good use, and he saw service in France and in Egypt, as well as in what was then known as Palestine. And he was part of General Allenby's march into Jerusalem. He couldn't swim, so it was very unfortunate that he was on a ship called the Ozymandias, which was bombed in Alexandria, and he nearly lost his life were it not for the fact that he was saved by a nurse who he never saw again, was never able to thank. But like many others returning to Civvy Street, he was given his demob money. He decided he wanted to put it to good use, to invest in a business. He didn't want to go in his father's business anymore, and he'd pretty well fallen out with his father as a result of that, because his decision to work in the markets meant that he would be working on Shabbat, would be mixing with other costermongers whose use of language was not that of the Queen, let us say. And also he would start eating foods that his father would definitely have disapproved of. And my father tells me a story that Jack was rather partial to bacon, and his father had cursed him that he should choke on the first piece of bacon that he ever eats. So ever after that, he would always cut away the first piece of bacon on a plate. So Jack, with his £30, he bought army surplus goods, the sort of thing that you wouldn't need a refrigerator for, such as condensed milk, biscuits. And yes, he did pretty well on his first day, and enough to reinvest it into the business. The most significant product that Jack sold in those early days was tea. And now we come to how Tesco got its name, because he was in partnership with a company called T.E. Stockdale, which was named after one of its founders. And it's the first three letters of T.E. Stockdale and the first two letters of the name Cohen that gave rise to the name. And one of the things that was mentioned in the Channel 5 documentary was that because there was so much anti-Semitism around at the time, it really wouldn't pass muster for Jack to have called his shops Cohen's, for example. For some reason, Brooke Bond and a lot of the tea manufacturers used chimpanzees to help promote their products, which Jack was happy to join in the fun. There he is again with Sissy, very long and happy marriage, which he speaks with great pride in Maurice Karuna's biography. Anyone who lived in Whitechapel would have frequented Bloom's, and although it's got nothing to do with Tesco, I found this comment by Giles Coren to be quite amusing, written upon the demise of Bloom's. There ought to be a shiver for Bloom's. We should put a plate of salt beef on a low chair. It's going to be replaced by some god-awful Burger King, which is exactly what happened. I'm an old Ashkenazi at heart. I don't like all that Israeli stuff. I'm suspicious of it. It's Arab food as far as I'm concerned. I don't want falafel and hummus at a Jewish restaurant. It's a bit ironic, Giles, giving his opinions about what kind of kosher food he likes, given that he got married in church, but he's a chip off the old block. He's a very entertaining writer. When Jack first graduated from market stalls to shops, he also went into wholesaling as well. And his first warehouse was in Upper Clapton Road. That was the first store in Burnt Oak, which is not a million miles away from Bushey. There was a Tesco Metro in Burnt Oak, which closed recently, which is rather unfortunate. There's an example of some of the lorries that were used by Tesco. He graduated from Upper Clapton to Edmonton, and then after Edmonton, Tesco head office moved to Chessington, Delamere Road, and now there's like a huge village in Welwyn Garden City, which is quite a sight to behold. It looks like something out of America. I was actually contacted, now that the head office at Chessington has been knocked down. It wasn't a very prepossession looking building anyway. They're going to build some flats there. And I was contacted by Tesco recently to ask me if it was okay if they named a couple of the new blocks of flats after Sir John and Lady Cohen, which I thought, with all these terrible stories of anti-Semitism that we see in social media and the press, I thought was rather nice that they contacted me. The future Jack knew was what was going on in America. In fact, he took a trip there in the early 1930s. And he wasn't overly impressed with the supermarkets. He didn't think that they would transfer easily to the UK. And in the event, it had to wait till after the war. One thing that where Jack was ahead of his time was that he appointed Daisy Hyams, who was born Daisy Hart, to become one of his buyers. And if you see the Channel 5 directory, if you see the Channel 5 documentary, you'll see that Ian McLaurin is full of praise for her abilities. So Jack had obviously, by the World War II, there were about 100 Tesco stores, and he was sufficiently well-heeled to go on a Mediterranean cruise. And in 1939, just before the outbreak of the war, they were staying in the south of France, and he got the last boat back from Dieppe, I think it was, just on September the 2nd, September the 1st, 1939. So a lucky escape for him. The idea of rationing was something that was thought up by Jack, and he had a kind of a point system, and that seemed to work so well that he was invited to join the Food Trade Emergency Committee. As an example of what rationing meant. And then after the war, let me just try and get rid of this at the top here. After the war, Tesco floated. Obviously, initially when Tesco was first established, it was very much a back of the envelope sort of enterprise. He didn't even have an accountant or solicitors for the company in the early years, but all that changed. And then after the war, he decided to have another go at supermarkets, and they opened the first one at St Albans on a trial basis. It wasn't that successful at first, but it was revisited, and the rest is history. Tesco was also involved in buying up other stores, Scotland, and eventually in Ireland as well. And back to my county, I wouldn't say it's my home county because I was actually born in Middlesex, but when I married, I moved over to Chigwell and Essex. So one way to attract customers was to give what he called value for money, but it seemed that more than that was required. So he did launch into Green Shield stamps, of which more later. The big supermarkets in the 60s weren't like the out-of-town centres we have now with the huge ground level parking. They tended to be multi-storey parking. So Tesco enlisted Green Shield stamps in 1963, while Sainsbury's rejected them. And they believed that stamps injected a momentum into their business, which inspired customer loyalty. So it was a combination of cheap prices, celebrities promoting Tesco, and the added incentive of those stamps, which people could buy Kenwood mixers or lawnmowers if they acquired enough books. But after Sainsbury's turned them down, it's ironic that Green Shield evolved into Argos in 1973, and Sainsbury's ended up buying it. I think that was probably 1.4 billion rather than 1.4 million. Eventually, like everything else in life, Green Shield stamps only had a limited value, and it was decided in 1977 to Tesco to change course a little bit. Jack was always in the news in the 60s. He was always in the newspapers, both for Green Shield stamps and for the abolition of resale price maintenance. So he was regarded as the consumer's friend, because resale price maintenance prevented large retailers from using their buying power to undercut the prices of small shops. And Jack lobbied Parliament to have RPM scrapped, and both the Labour and Conservative parties supported this. Obviously, there was a lot of opposition, but there was the people in powerful positions supported him. And that's an example of a Bex Bissell cleaner, vacuum cleaner, how much difference it would make both with and without resale price maintenance. It was just a way by which manufacturers could keep control over retailers. Just one other thing that came out of the Channel 5 documentary was that, as well as going into wholesale in the war period or just before it, Jack also bought up a farm in Essex, and he was able to use his farms to supply his supermarkets at the time. So he was very innovative in his approach. In fact, you can see some of the staff there at the Goldhanger farm, just above the photo. And then some of the superstores came into being in the late 60s. So both Jack's son-in-laws, Leslie Porter and Hyman Kreitman, succeeded him as chair. Although Jack stood down in 1969, he actually stayed on as president for some period of time. And although he was much admired by his staff and by his colleagues, he was also felt to be a man who was a great nagger, and really he did drive Hyman and Leslie to distraction. And there are some legendary stories of fisticuffs in the boardroom, which you can read about in some of these biographies. Tesco branched out into the sale of petrol in the early 70s. So Operation Checkout came into being on the Queen's Jubilee weekend, where Greensill stamps were scrapped, and Jack took Ian McLaurin by the lapels and said that if this dumping of Greensill stamps and your Operation Checkout fails, then it's all down to you. So no pressure there. That was the Tesco headquarters at Chessington, not a very prepossessing building, and it is no more. That's Jack's immediate successor, Lord McLaurin, the first non-Jewish chairman of Tesco, of course. His mother was not keen for him to work at Tesco's. There was certainly an element of snobbishness about Tesco. It was considered to be down market. But I don't think he's had cause to regret his choice of career. This was the last store that Jack attended. Ian McLaurin recounts how he took Jack to the gallery at Pitsea to observe everything, and he saw tears running down Jack's cheeks, because Jack was obviously remembering how the way things used to be when he opened his first of 10 stalls and how far that he'd come. And poignantly, Jack died the next day. Outside of Tesco, he was a Freemason and a member of the Worshipful Company of Carmen. He was also involved in various charities to do with Israel and looking after elderly people, which his wife carried on. There's the Lady Sarah Cohen house in Friern Barnet. Jeffrey Archer, what's he got to do with Jack Cohen? Well, as you can see by the barrow in the middle of that frontispiece of this book, this novel, As the Crow Flies, is loosely based upon a chap called Charlie Trumper, which is loosely based upon Jack Cohen. There's one of those English heritage plaques to Jack. So he did suffer a long period of ill health from about 1959, when he had the major surgery on his bowel. He wasn't a healthy man, but he did carry on both as chairman and then subsequently as president. And these are just some of the conclusions that he draws at the end of his career. The lessons I learned in the early days still apply. The company that works hard and insists upon offering value for money and is not afraid to experiment and make changes will always prosper. He's buried at the High Achievers Cemetery at Willesden, which is now an English heritage site. This is his message to younger people. So since Jack's demise, we've had a number of chairmen. Tesco Club Card has taken over from Ian McLaurin's ideas. And again, Sainsbury's thought that this was a one-day wonder and wouldn't take on. But of course, they do say that the best form of flattery is to copy somebody. And we all know that Sainsbury's have now introduced their Nectar card. And Sainsbury's were the market leaders, but they were supplanted by Tesco's. And I'm just going to canter through the last years now because I'm conscious of the fact that I've been speaking for too long, and I'm going to wrap up and ask for some questions. Of course, we all know that Tesco, after Terry Lee left, suffered severe reverses with the horse meat scandal, and also with the much more long-lasting scandal of their understated profits, or I should say overstated profits, which caused Tesco shares to tumble. Tesco's tries to represent both ends of the market, Tesco Value at the lower end and Tesco Finest, which are really quite competitive with Waitrose and Marks and Spencer. Some key facts about the stores. So as our introducer said at the start, for one in every £8 spent in a supermarket goes to Tesco. Not everybody likes Tesco. There's a book by a chap called Andrew Sims, points out some of the things that people say about Tesco, that they've destroyed the corner shop, that they've eaten into the countryside with their out of town sites. And there's always something to criticize for a major concern like that. I think that's a photo that comes from a Monopoly board. In fact, there's Jack playing Monopoly with Robert Morley and Sir James Gulliver. And you won't be surprised to know that, yeah, he won the game. So this was 2014. This is just a little bit about the big scandal that there was in Tesco's and the fine. They were fined as a result of it, and Philip Clark, who was the chairman, had to resign. You remember I showed a photograph at the start of the talk that one of the employees named his daughter after Shirley Porter. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you type into Google, why is Tesco hated so much, somebody simply typed out Shirley Porter. So Aldi and Lidl, they're the newest competitors with Tesco, and they decided at the end of the tenure of Sir Terry Lee to launch Jack's, mostly in the Midlands and the north of England. This is the one in Chatteris, just outside Cambridge, where there's a much smaller scale of goods on offer. They tend to be mostly British and reasonably priced. A lot of the financial journalists said that Jack's wouldn't last, but in fact it has been slowly expanding. It's not done badly at all. I certainly received a very warm welcome when I visited there and came out with a nice hamper of food. Actually, sorry, it wasn't Terry Louis, it was Dave Lewis, who was the previous chairman before Kevin Murphy. When Dave Lewis retired, he recalled the spirit of Jack Cohen And you can see all the photographs in there are ones that we've already seen on the slides. That's the new CEO. Came up from Boots. He'll probably also leave after about 3 years, as so many of them do. Just a little bit about Jack and being Jewish. I have this very deep feeling within myself. While I am British, I'm also Jewish by birth and conviction, but my feeling is not confined to one part of the Middle East. If only we could share it, as we are all akin, there would be peace. I'd like to see Israel survive, because it is so necessary for the world to have countries like this. What has been done is really a miracle. As a Roman Catholic looks towards Rome, I regard Israel as my spiritual home. Would Tesco under Jack Cohen label products as coming from the West Bank or even Palestine rather than Israel? I think not, and they definitely would not get involved in any kind of boycott. But Tesco today, despite what the internet warriors say, is no longer a Jewish company in the same way that Marks and Spencer's isn't. But some people take a lot of convincing. If they're convinced that Jack's wife's name is Tessa, they're convinced that Tesco and Marks and Spencer's are Jewish companies. That was Linda Porter. She wrote a little poem. If you want to know a little bit more about Tesco, there's a lot of recordings at the British Library, which you can get by Googling it on the internet. And there you have taped recordings by the likes of Ian McLaurin, Terry Lee, Shirley Porter, and David Malpass, and some of the employees of Tesco. So that's well worth a visit. You've also got my email details there. So if you've got any questions you want to ask me that weren't covered today, then I shall be very happy to answer them. But I think I'll stop screen sharing now. I've done my 45 minutes, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Richard, thank you for that very quick canter through Tesco's. There's so much to it, and brings back so many memories as you delve into it. And what a business it's become these days from that little acorn. I mean,
yes,
I've just insured my car through Tesco Insurance. It was the best quote on Go Compare. So even in areas like that, it's very much.
They've got their own bank as well, yeah.
Yes, indeed they have. And in fact, I spent my early working life in the grocery trade, so always kept a wary eye on what was going on with Tesco's. And the name Daisy Hyams was always known to me as a very feisty lady, a very hard business woman who negotiated very hard with suppliers. You mentioned a name, if you don't mind, just first question from me. You mentioned Mossy Vanger. Now, I had family who were also in the supermarket business, and I remember them doing business with Mossy Vanger. He was a bit of a wheeler dealer, was he? And
yes,
wholesaler.
I should have done a bit more research on this, but there were two companies. One was called Price Right, and the other one was called Victor Value.
That's right.
Tesco gobbled up. I think Mossy Vanger was involved with Victor Value, but I'm happy to stand corrected. I don't know if he was a nephew of Jack as well, but he did look fairly similar age actually in that photo. Right. So okay. I need to jam up on that as well.
And you've just mentioned another one, Price Right. My cousins, who I worked for a while, had their own supermarket business and eventually sold out to Price Right. There's so many names that we could go through and disappeared off the high street, but clearly Price Right was one of those. Right, okay. Sorry, go on.
Very happy to answer any questions if anyone wants to raise the hand metaphorically or... Right, Howard Grant, if you'd like to unmute, Howard. Right.
It's really reminiscent. I met Jack Cohen on a couple of occasions because he was related to a very close friend of my parents. And I can remember he used to walk around sometimes with tins of sardines and he would give them out. Or certainly when I saw him, he'd done that a couple of times. And also Mossy Vanger. Mossy Vanger was with Victor Value. And I think it was Michael Kay who was with Price Right.
Yes, that's right.
But I'd certainly met Jack Cohen and Mossy Vanger on more than one occasion. Obviously, I was somewhat younger than I am now. And he was always a very personable person. He was a man of the people. You know, people was is stock in trade. I always remember that. Could speak to anybody about anything. These are my recollections.
But certainly not a man to cross swords with, as I would imagine a lot of captains of industry.
Yes,
they don't bear falls gladly. Actually, talking about swords, there is one incident between Jack and Leslie Porter, when in the ballroom there were a couple of Wilkinson swords hanging up on the wall, and they actually took these swords down and went at each other like a couple of fencers. So, next question.
Your parents talk about lost in fact.
Roddy, unmute yourself.
Yeah, just a question. Who are the main shareholders these days of that company?
Well, besides the general public, you mean?
Yeah.
I actually don't know, to be honest. I mean, I would imagine that the directors, if you were to go onto the Tesco company PLC, they would tell you all the directors, and you could probably do a company search to find out who exactly they are. But I don't think anyone has yet put in a bid to buy Tesco. And I would imagine that the only people that could do that would be Walmart, but they're very busy trying to buy up Asda at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
I think the other thing I ought to mention is how Tesco has coped with the coronavirus. I think, despite a lot of teething problems, they were pretty quick off the mark with home deliveries. And I think it's fair to say that whatever other privations the general public has had since lockdown back in March 2020, not having enough to eat is not one of them. But it would be nice to know if anybody could just tell me as a consumer whether they prefer to shop in these new German arrivals from Aldi and Lidl to shopping in Tesco, or why they don't like Tesco or why they do like Tesco. Not that I've got any interest in it from a financial point of view, just from an interest point of view.
Sylvia?
Yeah, Colin and I are very impressed at the way Tesco are handling Aldi and Lidl's. We get these club card prices now, which are very, very good. They have a couple of ranges called Miss Molly, and I think it's green fields in the yogurt. I think they're doing a very, very good job, and we always enjoy shopping there, and we find the prices very, very good. No, see.
Okay.
Oh, thank you for that. There's nobody here that's worked for Tesco then in any capacity?
I did in the early. I have done for a short period of time in my early retail days. I actually worked initially for a small multi supermarket called Charles Phillips. I don't know if you even came across them.
I've heard of it actually. Yes.
Okay. They had quite a few shops, but they eventually were bought by Tesco's. And for a short period of time, I worked for Tesco's in some of their supermarkets before going to work for my cousin. So, yes, it was quite an experience to work from what was a sort of medium-sized company like Charles Phillips to a much bigger they weren't international, but a vast company by comparison. And the size of the stores as they got bigger and bigger, it has just been amazing. And when you think how they started off in the food trade and now what an important part they play in the clothes trade and decorating, it's just, you walk into their stores, they're not supermarkets, they're Tesco extras, they're what we probably used to call hypermarkets. Yes, I mean, for example, you have to pay an annual fee, don't you, to go to Costco, but you could probably get as many electrical products at Tesco Extra as you could at Costco. One thing I didn't mention was they attempted to penetrate the American market, which is the notorious graveyard for British companies, Witness, Marks and Spencer's. They opened up some stores called Fresh and Easy, mostly in California, and I believe on the eastern seaboard as well. But it just didn't catch on. They just hadn't done sufficient research. And after about 5 years, I think they closed that. And Tesco have reduced their market share
in Asia and some of the East European countries as well, and they're just trying to concentrate on the UK now.
I think many British retailers have become a cropper in the state. Even Marks and Spencer's used to own Brook Brothers. And,
that's right.
And in
it's
France,
a very different market.
And the continent the same. Marks and Spencer's had to pull out of France eventually as well, I think. And very strong in the UK. And I can only talk highly of Tesco's. In the last 18 months or so, their home delivery service has been absolutely wonderful. I can't remember the last time I walked into a Tesco stores, but we get this service delivered to our door every week, and they are superb in terms of their delivery drivers. And even before the pandemic, you know, I know that even when there was thick snow on the ground, the Tesco van would get through. So all credit to them for that.
Yeah.
Rita.
Yeah.
Go on, Rita.
Yeah, hi Richard. I just want to say I used to be loyal to one supermarket when I was young and had the children. But since I retired, I go anywhere. I buy my chocolate in Lidl's, I buy this in Tesco, I buy the other thing in Morrison's. When I'm in Asda, I buy something in Asda. So I shop now anywhere. Whilst before, you know, when I was young, I was just loyal to one supermarket.
Well, I think that's exactly the same for my wife and I. I mean, we live in Loughton, but we've got Morrison's, Sainsbury's, Lidl, Aldi, all within about half a mile's distance, and we just go wherever suits us on the day. Because I think basically they're selling very similar produce.
I like to go to Tesco.
Yeah.
It's amazing how companies come along that can challenge a company like Tesco's, because that's what Aldi have done, haven't they, in terms of price. When you look at their price reduction, their advertising now says compared to Aldi, our prices are as cheap. So what a turnabout that is.
Yeah.
I suppose the difference between successful businessmen and the rest of us is that we always tend to think that the market is saturated, don't we? Whereas somebody who's got a lot of business courage can still see that there is room in the market for competitors, whether it's in terms of Wimpy Bars and McDonald's and now Wendy's and Burger King or any other commodity.
Yeah, indeed. Michael? Where you gone, Michael?
He's gone to Spain.
Well,
he is in Spain, so he's obviously dropped out.
I don't want to deprive anybody of their afternoon tea. Or
Mr. Hammerman has got his.
Do you think that Tesco's and some of the other supermarkets might regret opening up such huge stores? After all, they've got to fill them with things that people want to buy, and maybe they regret opening up such monster stores?
I think they do, and I think that because people are buying so much online now, there is a less inclination to go and do these mammoth monthly or weekly shops and these out-of-town places. And I mean, if you only want about 3 or 4 items, they're a nightmare, aren't they? If you want some soap and some milk, you know, you have to kind of go from one end of the store to the other, and it's not particularly pleasant experience. And that's why Tesco Metro, the small town in high street locations, I think have come into their own again, and especially in garages. Although I must say that there seem to be less Tesco outlets in garages than there are Marks and Spencer's and Sainsbury's now. So I'm not quite sure why that happened. I think they fell out with Esso. They certainly did in Loughton, although there is one in Edgware, isn't there? There's a Tesco store in the Esso garage on the way from Edgware to Stanwell.
We have one here in Bushy.
Yeah.
We go regularly.
Yes, we do.
Michael?
Michael.
Oh, you're back.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that it's actually coming full circle with the pilot high, sell it cheap. There's a Lithuanian supermarket chain we're planning to open in the UK, where everything will just be on pallets, no shelves, everything you'll just walk in, buy it straight off the pallets. So once again, pilot high, sell it cheap. It's come full circle.
some people will like that, but others won't. So can I just ask, how does Tesco cater for the Jewish customer in Bushey? Is there much? Do they have much of a kosher range?
No, no.
Not in the one in Watford.
Oh yes, there is.
Yes, there is.
There's a very
Yes.
good range there.
They do in Boreham Wood, because the rabbi at Boreham Wood Shul made sure that they stocked a reasonable range of kosher food.
And also there's a Jewish home across the road, and a lot of them say it's wonderful to go over there, and they get quite a lot of kosher bits and pieces that they want, and I think that's wonderful.
And they do quite a range at Pesach as well these days at
Absolutely.
Boreham Wood and other places.
But the one in Bushey here, our little one, that does very well.
I suppose, Richard, you know, things have changed so dramatically on the high street that it's affected all retailers. I remember many, many years ago hearing about the internet had just arrived, and somebody was forecasting that sometime eventually 10% of spend will be through the internet. Well, that's long been superseded. I think it's now like 25% of all spend, or 30% spend is on the internet, and it has grown significantly because of the pandemic and people shopping online. So, you know, even the mighty Tesco's and all the supermarkets have had to rethink their policies and how they do business with people.
The only constant in business life, as well as life generally, is change. Because when I moved to Loughton, we probably had about 6 travel agents, and now there are none. So the future is very hard to predict. But one thing is sure, is that we'll always need to eat.
This is true.
And Tesco were very quick on getting onto the cheap beer market as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Tesco overtook Sainsbury's, because, you know, they honed in so much on the sale of alcohol and also Sunday trading. In fact, Tesco jumped the gun on Sunday trading. I think they started opening before the legislation was on the statute book.
Not only that, you can now shop 24 hours at Tesco's and stores open all night. Incredible.
Rita?
Hi, Richard. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the Amazon supermarkets? I think they're 4, 5 now in this country. Well, the Amazon one, where you don't need to, I mean, you just go on your phone and you pay through you pick and you pay, and you pick and you pay.
Yes. Well, I think they've teamed up with have they not teamed up with Morrison's Amazon? And I think that's probably done Morrison's a lot of good, and the way things are delivered as well. So actually, during the pandemic, we couldn't get a slot with Tesco, and we ended up using Iceland for a lot of our stuff, which we'd always vowed never to set foot in Iceland, because we thought it was really just for frozen food. But you know, they've had to diversify as well.
Richard, I was reading the other day that Tesco's have been trialing a shop at their head office where there's no cash handled at all. Everything is done electronically. It's been working very well, and they intend starting rolling this out nationally now. So I believe. I don't know if you read much about it.
I did.
That's what Amazon are doing. Amazon are doing that.
Yeah, this is the first Tesco one, though.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, I think it's important to point a couple of issues out here in terms of what the policies as far as supermarkets are concerned. I did have some experience of it all many years ago, and it's this. Online food shopping is a completely separate business and will stand or fall on its own merits. When they come to working out whether or not it's profitable for them to open a hypermarket or supermarket, and it's not just Tesco, it's all of the major brand names that we're aware of, they look to take, for example, £100 per square foot, provided they have the footfall and provided they are taking this £100 per square foot of selling space, then they will continue to open supermarkets and hypermarkets. This is unconnected, as I said earlier, with online shopping for food, which of course has a totally different factor. But as I said, as long as they are taking the X pounds per square foot, then they'll continue to thrive and they'll continue to open supermarkets. And my own experience, or Daphne and my own experience, is of Tesco Watford. Now, if you look at the footfall there now, it's amazing. They're taking, I would suspect, much more than their, shall we say, £100 per square foot, and will continue to maintain doing so. So that's the way they look at it. And it's important to understand that.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Anyway, I very much enjoyed the opportunity to speak to you today. As I said, I did a talk about Winston Churchill and the Jews a couple of years ago, and I'm now preparing one on the Balfour Declaration. So if you'll have me back again, I shall be very pleased to revisit.
We will be
delighted. We will be delighted, and thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. We learned a lot of new things, particularly where the name Tesco's comes from, and you know, it was a pleasure. And thank you very, very much. And we look forward to you coming along again, hopefully back in the shawl.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Enjoy the summer when it finally arrives.
We'll try.
Okay.
Thank you. Just before you all go, just to remind you, on Thursday, Current Affairs, Jeffrey Zemmer will be your host for that. And next Tuesday, we have a very interesting talk. It's called Ziggy's Story. It's by Lou Simons, who is daughter. I actually have heard this talk with another charity, and I found it so interesting that I put them on to Daphne, and hence it's now being incorporated into our program. It is another very interesting survival story and well worth listening to. So see you all either Thursday, or if not, PG next Tuesday, and have a good week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Should we go?
Bye, everybody.